G'day and welcome to the Bionicle Inspiration Series. This is the show where we spotlight mocks from across the Bionicle community to give you some ideas for your own future builds. Today's episode is all about frames. Now, I've done a few of these before on the channel. Essentially what I mean by a frame is when you look at like a typical, say, like Hero Factory set, they are just a frame of CCBS bone pieces and armor put over the top. Now, it's certainly one way that you could approach building any kind of construction mock is to do exactly the same thing. You could build any sort of frame and then armor it over the top. So I want to, in this episode, specifically focus on a few mocks that showcase the frame and how it's built, and then let's analyze certain techniques or things that are going on that maybe you could implement into your own specific frames. Now, a lot of this you'd have to be designing your own frames, so I'm just giving you a few ideas for how you could do so. In previous episodes of the Bionicle Inspiration Series, when we focused on frames, some of these frames have actually had instructions, so be sure to check out some of those previous episodes if that's specifically what you're looking for. But let's dive into the very first frame mock now, shall we? So we begin with a mock by He Grabbed the Sun, and this is Eva Berserker, but it's still a work in progress, as I'm sure you can tell by the pictures and the state of the mock. But it's, I think, always really helpful to study work in progress pictures like this to get a bit of a better insight as to what's going on with sort of the internal structure of a mock like this. So I'm going to go through some of the various stages of progress with this mock. There's actually a bunch more that I haven't covered, so be sure to check the links in the description to see some of the other stages of progress with this mock. But starting off with this image here, we can see how posable this is, and I think that's incredibly impressive for the size of this mock. Often when you get really big, sometimes they just get too top heavy, or mocks just become just, I don't know, there's a lot to it. And as a result, posability can be harder to achieve. But it's insane to see some of the very realistic poses that the legs are getting in at that point. That might change when armor goes over the top, because sometimes the armor gets in the way of the joints and it becomes a little difficult to do that. But right now, it's incredibly impressive with how posable this is. It's just awesome to see. I also like seeing kind of some of the articulation points here. So when we look at the knees, we can see what I believe is this specific gear piece, which is a bit of a larger piece. And it looks like that's what's being used so that there is a bit of posability going on. So it's interesting to see when gears and things are used like that, because we saw a lot of gear functions in actual Bionicle sets, but it's crazy to think, what you can do with that on a much larger scale or a more complex mock like this. So that in itself is awesome. I also think I can see some of these pieces, which if you put a few of them together, it creates a complete circle. And I think we can see it at the top here on sort of like shoulder area. Now, I imagine because it's that circle, it creates a lot of different sort of like, attachment points with different pinholes and different things. So there's a lot you can kind of build off of that. But I also get the sense that maybe, I don't know, I initially thought that the fact that that big circular gear piece is being used helps the posability up the top there, but I don't know if it does. I think maybe some of the internal structure is built so that it can like hinge and the arms can move, and maybe it sort of also locks in place so it doesn't just like wildly swing or something. Honestly, it's really hard to tell. It's a big technic mess in the middle there. But I think that's kind of reassuring too. You can always create some weird elaborate mess of pieces and then just cover it up with armor later. It gets the job done, right? So that in itself is very interesting to see. Moving over to some of these other pictures now, we can see some of the brilliant system detail that's been implemented over the top of this structure. It very much looks like it's sort of like panels or something that's being placed over the top of this detailing, which I think is smart. It kind of literally feels like armor that would go over the top of a human's body. And obviously, this is, I guess, the Bionicle's body, because it's this weird sort of greebled mesh underneath, but it gets the job done. So interesting to see that, and really nice to see some of these more sort of system-focused details with like grills and intricate patterns and things like that. It looks really, really nice, and I like the fact that he's really taking his time with this build, really focusing on the structural integrity of it, the posability of it, and the detailing of it. If you're building a huge mock like this, I definitely think that's the smart thing to do, is really take your time so that you really get that awesome, perfect result with it. I understand time is not always something that everyone has, but hey, if you're willing to commit to a really long period of time on a project like this, you're going to get some awesome results. I think that's very clear with this mock here. It's awesome. I like in some of these images here, we can see tubing that appears to be covering up some of the underlying detail that we were seeing before. I like that because the tubing should bend, I guess, with the joints. It shouldn't really get in the way and block posability, but it covers up some of the underlying details that you probably don't want to see on a mock like this. And it also still kind of looks looks like that's sort of like underlying detail, sort of almost like robotic veins or pipes or tubing or pistons or whatever. So really smart way of covering that up. I think that's awesome. We can also see some very like large pistons sort of at the bottom there, kind of around the waist. And then later on, we can also see them on the torso as well. Now, these are some pretty big pistons. And there's a variety of different piston pieces across Bionicle and Technic sets. Definitely wise to use these on mocks like this because they're really going to help support things and hold things up and just add that little bit of extra support that a mock like this probably needs in order to actually hold itself up. So definitely a MVP piece there. Most valuable piece, not most valuable player. Taking a look at some of the armor towards the top here, it's interesting to note that it kind of looks like this big giant ring that's not actually attached to anything that we've been looking at before. Again, I think it's very similar to what we were seeing with some of the other armor, that it's quite separate from the underlying structure, so it doesn't mess with the posability. I think that's super smart. Also nice to see this big sort of ring at the top here, which I imagine would be very easy to build off of because look at how many connection points there are there. That in itself I think is super cool. In the description on one of the photos on Instagram, he said that as he progresses with this mock, he wants to make sure that the sort of top area is very hollow. Well, to quote him, he said, working on the chest, which will likely be more of a skeletal armor to keep the weight down. Now, I think that's super important, especially on the top of such a large mock like this, making sure that it is not super heavy, otherwise it's just going to fall over on itself. So yeah, kind of what we were talking about of that sort of like armor panels over a sort of more slimmed down but still sturdy skeletal structure underneath is certainly the way to go so that it can actually hold itself up. So a very complex process here, but it's interesting how much we can learn about how this is built when we study some of these images here, and there's heaps more that you can learn just from looking at these. So hey, definitely take a look at the links in the description and see some of the other stuff that this builder has done with this mock, because man, it's cool and there's a lot you can learn from it, that's for sure. Okay, this next one is by Bionicle, and this is Lambda version 3. This is insane, this mock. What I like about this is actually a finished mock. Obviously what we were looking at before was still a work in progress, but I love the fact that essentially this is just a frame. Yes, it's a very sort of like dense frame, so there's not really any like gaps or anything in there, but it's really nice to see a mock that doesn't really have huge amounts of armor over the top, and that it is just this very sort of like mechanical, detailed robot of sorts. It's a very brilliant aesthetic, and the way that the colors have been blocked, and like the orange and the olive green together, it's a beautiful color combination. There's just such a unique aesthetic to this mock, and I just adore it. So hey, sometimes there's a lot of beauty in a good frame design. Why not just keep it as just purely that and nothing more? You don't always have to armor it if you think it actually still looks pretty good. So yeah, by all means do that, because this looks gorgeous. I love how this looks. So this is actually quite a complex mock. It took me a bit to kind of wrap my head around it, and I still don't think I've fully got my head wrapped around it. This is some high-tech stuff. But some things that I kind of noticed from this. There's a lot of pistons in this. Specifically, when we look at like the legs, for example, we can see one of those very typical piston pieces and then a Hordeca neck. So those two connection points connect the lower leg to the foot. And obviously that's a very smart way to do that, because I'm sure that the top of this mock is maybe a bit heavier because it does look like there's a lot of pieces there, but it could be very hollow on the inside. It's hard to say, but I don't think it is. And it certainly looks like it needs that additional bit of support on the legs. To hold itself up, because maybe just having one specific ball joint that connects the lower leg to the foot might just not be enough to support its own weight, or it might sort of topple over itself or whatever. So smart to do that, to add multiple different connection points so it can really be sturdy in that regard. Additionally, there's this orange piston piece, which is similar to the one we saw before, but of course in orange, as I stated. And it is sort of on the leg here, and you can see how it sort of moves all the way up towards sort of the waist area there. Now, there's this shot here where we can see the mock in this really awesome pose. And unless I'm mistaken, the mock looks like it can hold itself up in that pose without having to be held or anything like that. Maybe it's photoshopped. I don't know. I don't think so. It looks like with the way this is designed, it would be able to support its own weight very well. Now, yeah, it looks like because that piston goes so low into the leg and then all the way up to essentially the waist, I imagine that that's how it can hold itself up, is that just, I don't know, the way that the maths of that works, it's able to do crazy cool stuff. So look, I'll be honest, I'm not great with Lego maths or physics or whatever. But it looks like that's how that's working. I might be wrong, but it certainly appears to be. So yeah, definitely something to consider is the placement of those pistons and how they link to other parts of the body to help with stability in that sense. And I mean, if I was doing something like that, I just do a lot of trial and error until I know it works. Or maybe I'd consult other sort of like realistic robot designs to see how the pistons of that interact and work. And maybe that could help you wrap your head around it, because I'll be honest, I have a lot of trouble wrapping my head around how that exactly works, but man, it looks cool. There's additionally some pistons we can see on the waist, and it's interesting in this photo as well. You can see how one is a bit sort of shorter than the other because he's sort of like moving his body a little bit there. So it's really interesting to see how those pistons almost sort of breathe to a degree to allow for those little slight variations in posability. It's absolutely gorgeous. Some other details that aren't necessarily about the frame itself. I love this mask design with the gears just sort of poking out up against this flipped over mask here. It's a really, really nice look. Additionally, I like the fact that he has this like gun holster on the side there. It looks really cool without anything on it, but as you can see in this image here, it appears that he can sort of like fold up the gun and then stow it in that sense, which is awesome. So yeah, a really, really clever design there. And yeah, I don't know, don't really see too many gun holsters on mocks, I suppose. So yeah, really cool to see. And now we've got a mock by Christian Littan, and this is a mecha frame. So this is a specific frame that we'll be talking about, and then this turns into actually quite a variety of different mocks. Oh, okay. Well, I just reread the post. It says here, the base of my kits that I use for my mecha, and then says wink wink in the comments. So maybe this doesn't actually become that. Maybe this is just implied, because I guess the idea with this is that it's meant to look like actual kind of like mecha model kits like Gundam and other stuff. And it's like, here it is sort of before you add the armor on with the actual like spruces and stuff, you got to pop it off. And then here it is with, you know, all finished and stuff like that. So it's sort of more like just an aesthetic, cool photography kind of choice in that sense. But I don't know, the way that I was looking at these, I'm pretty sure this frame is at least pretty close to being what is used within these designs here. But let's talk about them separately. Let's focus on the actual frame for now, because even still, there's a lot we can learn from this frame. So we can see this specific plate with like a hole on the end of it. Here it is on Bricklink. And this is being used on the legs here. It's an interesting way of connecting it, especially because, normally putting things into those sort of like, those hole pieces there, you can relate it back to Technic pieces. You could put it in between different studs and things like that. So you can create a variety of different connection points, but also it can make for a very sturdy design in that sense. So a nice piece to be using there to sort of bridge everything together. Very cool. Additionally, we can see this cool connection, which is a sort of similar philosophy with these 2x2 rounded plate pieces here that are used on the elbow. So those are just connected directly into those Technic pieces there, because again, that pinhole can be connected into studs in that manner, and it makes for a very nice looking elbow design and certainly gets the job done. I feel like with a lot of this arm, because it is right now just sort of various like Technic connector pieces there, I feel like when this is implemented into a bigger sort of frame, these would be changed out for a very different arm design. But still, I'm sure you could armor stuff around it if you really wanted to, but there's a lot less connection points for you to be able to do so. So it's interesting to note that some of these frames could very well be swapped out with different alternatives later on when, the design calls for something else. But for now, you give it a sort of like rough arm design so you know roughly where the proportions are or something like that. So yeah, interesting to see. I also like the fact that he's used some of these feet pieces from like the Protectors and other kind of Hero Factory sets and things on the sort of torso area here, because again, those foot pieces had the sort of like toe connections. So if you really wanted to, you could have some bar connections that you could kind of branch off and add detail onto with the torso there. And, you can kind of see that with the legs as well. There's a lot of different connection points on this frame, which is, I think, really helpful to do if you are building a frame. Have as many connection points as possible, because it gives you a lot of opportunity to add armor over the top of it later. I think it's very smart and wise to do, and that's a nice example of a little sort of subtle area of that where it works well. So let's talk about some of the actual mocks that are using this specific frame, and let's try and see if these actually do use the frame or not. So here's this cool green one here. I really like the inclusion of some of these dragon head pieces from, I believe that's Lloyd's Dragon from the Ninjago movie, and nice to see it partnered with some of these Ben 10 torso pieces as well. It's great to see some decent integration with some construction-focused pieces, especially when it works so well with these other system pieces. Those dragon dragon heads almost sort of blur the line between construction and system in that sense. So very, very nice to see those partnered together. I really like this purple one. It's a very nice color scheme. The purple and the gray work very nicely together. We can see on the arms here that he has used that exact same elbow design that we saw on the frame. So, whether or not that wink wink that he said in the description on Flickr means that this is not actually the specific frame, there's certain things that are being translated. And we can see here, I believe these are those 2x2 plates with the sort of stud adjacent from it. We can see those, in purple there, making up the leg design like we saw on the frame. So it appears that it's pretty similar in that sense. Another awesome one here, we can see some of these rocker head pieces being used on the shoulders here. I love how that looks. Very sort of, almost kind of reminds me of Power Rangers and stuff. It's a great idea to use some of those as sort of shoulder armor. And additionally, I like the fact on the back, we can see some of these shin pieces in black that came from some of the Star Wars Ultra Build sets being used as sort of like jet booster engines or something on the back. It's a very nice design. This red mech is also really cool. I love seeing some of these Praetorian Guard armor pieces, again, from the Star Wars Ultra Build sets, and how nicely the textures of that mimic the head design here. Really, really cool, once again, to see some construction-focused pieces just beautifully integrated in with system pieces. I just adore how that looks. And then additionally, on this final one here, we can see some more Hero Factory torso armor pieces on the shoulders. Those make for a great-looking shoulder design, and again, it's nice to see it partnered with more system pieces. That's certainly the highlight of a lot of these mocks, is the beautiful integration of pieces from different themes and things here. It looks magnificent. So that's it for a bunch of different frames in this frame episode of the Bionicle Inspiration series. Hopefully that gave you a few different ideas or ways of approaching building your own unique frames, or maybe it's just given you a bit of insight about posability and underlying structures of mocks that you can take into the future when you're building, hopefully. Thank you for watching. There's links in the description to all of the mocks that you saw today in the episode, so be sure to check out some of the other stuff that these builders have done, and maybe leave your thoughts on their mocks as well. Comment on their Instagrams and Flickrs and stuff like that. I'm sure they'd appreciate the insight. And then also there is the submission email that is on your screen right now, but also in the description. So if you have mocks that you want to see on the show, submit them to that email and I'll do my best to put them in a future episode. Thank you again. I know I've said it a few times now, but hey, thanks for watching. I do appreciate you. I love you tons. Happy building, and bye for now.